winter, we might be thinking it's a little more difficult to get outside and take those breaks from being indoors. Well, I just want to show you, if you're interested in trees and you enjoy our natural areas, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to work on your tree ID while trees are in winter condition, which means they don't have leaves on them. So we often rely on leaf shape to identify trees during the growing season. And today we're going to take a look at tree identification during the winter. Okay, so the first stop I'm going to make today, right here next to Furnace Brook, is next to the shrub species. And we'll talk about how I know this is a dogwood species. The three characteristics that I want to focus on today are the 3 B's of winter ID, and that is branching structure, bark, and buds. So here in the Northeast, we have 2 different kinds of branching structures that most of our trees display, and that is opposite branching structure and alternate branching structure. We only have a few trees that exhibit opposite branching structure, and those are maple trees, ash trees, dogwoods, and horse chestnut, or some people call those buckeye trees. And we remember that by using the nomenclature mad horse or mad buck. So when you're walking through parks and taking a closer look at trees and shrubs, one of the first things I recommend that you look at is branching structure. If it has opposite branching, you know it's either a maple, ash, dogwood, or horse chestnut. If it's an alternate, well, that's going to send you down an entirely different path. So if we look a little more closely at the shrub species that's behind me, I'm looking at this very distinctive, beautiful red bark and the shrub-like form, and I know this to be characteristic of dogwood species, and dogwoods are often shrubby species that grow in wetter areas. And we also have some dogwoods that are ornamental trees, so some of you may have them in your yards as a landscape tree. So that's the first species we're going to take a look at today. Then we're going to move on to a young tree that's nearby. So I'm going to take a minute and talk about this young tree that was just planted within the last year here in Elmwood Park. This is a really popular tree species in the city of Syracuse. It's a great landscape tree. This is a serviceberry. If we look a little closer at the branching structure, this does not have opposite branching. It has alternate branching. So you can see here that the branches come off the main branch alternate of each other. So that's a big clue. But let's think about, we know there are only 4 trees that have opposite branching structure. That means all of our other trees have alternate branching structure. So that's a lot. So we have to start to look a little more specifically at other characteristics. And I'm going to point out the buds on this serviceberry tree. They are also arranged alternately on the stem, and they are long and very pointy at the end. This bud at the end is called the terminal bud. It's very pointy, reddish brown color. The bud scales are kind of fuzzy, and that is a big clue to the serviceberry. So we can look more closely at these bud scales that are protecting the bud from winter weather conditions and see that they have a little bit of hairiness to them, and that helps us to narrow this down to a serviceberry. The bark is a smooth gray at this stage, This tree will produce clusters of white flowers in April and May. It's one of our earliest blooming trees and actually has delicious edible berries in June. So this is one to keep an eye on in your neighborhood. So, sometimes we're fortunate enough to be able to identify trees purely because of their distinctive bark. So, I'm about halfway down one of the trails here in Elmwood Park, and we're surrounded by maple trees, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in the middle of all these maple trees, you can see this very distinctive, dark-barked, kind of flaky looking, like burnt potato chips. This is a black cherry. It's a beautiful straight black cherry tree growing right here on the hillside in Elmwood Park. And we can be very confident about identifying this tree just by looking at the bark in the winter. So next time you go out and you're walking in your park or in the woods, see if you can find any black cherry. One more tree that has very distinctive bark that's so easy to identify in winter condition is shagbark hickory. And so down here you see these sort of long, deep furrows. This is an older tree, but if you look up towards the top, wow, you can really see what gives it its name. The bark is really rough, really shaggy, peels off in long, narrow strips. Younger shagbark hickories have that all along the tree stem. So this is another tree that really you just need to be familiar with the very distinct bark in order to be able to identify it in winter conditions. So we're gonna stop for a minute and talk about this tree. This is a beech tree, and it has kind of distinctive bark. A healthy beech tree has really smooth, light gray bark, and it kind of looks like an elephant's leg. But most of the beech trees that we'll find in our forests today have a lot of these pock marks on them, which is evidence of beech bark disease, which is prevalent on beech trees throughout our whole area. And it is a disease complex. It's actually caused by a fungus that's introduced to the tree by a beetle. So when beech trees are under stress, they produce clones of themselves from root suckers. And you can see all of this low-growing, sapling-sized trees around me. These are little beech suckers that are genetically identical to this big diseased beech tree. So a couple of clues to look for winter ID: the gray bark. The pock marking is a big clue for beech tree. This root suckering, that is very often growing around a bigger beech tree. And then the buds are very distinctive. They're an alternate branching species, and the buds are very tightly rolled, longer buds. Terminal bud is about 3/4 of an inch long, rolled very tight, very pointy end, kind of looks like a cigar. So that is a big clue, identify beech. So looking at bark, the disease evidence, root sucker evidence, alternate branching, and the distinctive bud. This hillside in Elmwood Park is covered with sugar maple trees, and sugar maples are my favorite tree. It's also the state tree of New York. They are beautiful all season long. They have a beautiful wide crowns when they're open grown. Some of the best color, golden color that we see in the city come from our maple trees. Here in the park, they grow straighter and taller with more narrow crowns because they're planted closer together. And maple is one of our opposite branching tree species. So when I came here for the very first time, I looked up into the tree leaves Noticed that they were opposite each other, that the branches were opposite each other, and I knew that it was either a maple, ash, or dogwood. It was summer, so I could see the leaves, and I cheated a little bit, and I knew that it was a maple tree. But you can also tell sugar maples by the bark. So bark development in sugar maple trees, it's a little bit smoother when they're younger, but as they mature, like this tree, they develop these long furrows that kind of peel away from the tree and peels up. So you can sort of see how I can put my hands behind this bark furrow. Very distinctive characteristic of sugar maple bark. Buds in the winter are pointy and brown, and they are also opposite each other coming off the branches that they're growing on. And I get excited about maple trees because I like to make maple syrup in the spring, and I hope to be able to bring you some more videos as we go into 2021 and show you some of the maple sugaring that we do here in Elmwood Park.